This is my true story. My medication made me smell bad after my leg injury and infection, an odor I couldn't control no matter how many times I showered or what products I used. My wife and son started hiding me when their rich friends visited, treating me like I was something disgusting they needed to keep secret. Last Friday, they told me to stay in the bathroom during their dinner party. Then I heard the lock click from the outside. 2 days later, I was still trapped in that tiny room, but they never expected what happened next. Before I tell you, tell us where you're watching from, and please subscribe so more people hear this story. 6 months ago, I fell down the stairs in my house and shattered my left leg badly enough that I needed emergency surgery with plates and screws to hold the bones together. The surgery went well initially, but 3 weeks later, the incision site became infected with bacteria that the doctors said could have cost me my entire leg if not treated aggressively. They put me on extremely strong antibiotics and other medications to fight the infection and prevent it from spreading to my bone, medicines that were necessary to save my leg but came with side effects nobody had warned me about. Started noticing within days of beginning the medication that I was sweating excessively even when sitting still in air conditioning, my clothes becoming soaked through multiple times daily from perspiration I couldn't control. The sweating brought with it a body odor that was different from normal sweat smell, something chemical and unpleasant that came from the medications being processed through my body. No amount of showering or deodorant could mask it completely. The smell seemed to come from inside me and radiated outward no matter what I did. Tried everything I could think of to manage the odor problem. Showered 3 times a day using antibacterial soap and strong body wash. Applied clinical strength deodorant constantly. Changed my clothes multiple times daily. Washed my bedding every other day. Bought special odor eliminating sprays and powders. Tried different brands of soap and deodorant recommended by pharmacists. Even changed my diet, thinking certain foods might be making it worse. Nothing helped because the smell was a side effect of the medication chemistry itself working through my system. My doctor explained that the antibiotics I was taking were extremely powerful and necessary to save my leg from amputation, that the excessive sweating and body odor were known side effects that affected about 30% of patients on this particular drug combination. Said the medication regimen would last at least 4 months until the infection was completely cleared and my leg had healed properly, that I'd have to tolerate the side effects because stopping the medication early could result in the infection returning and potentially losing my leg entirely. Felt humiliated every time I left my bedroom knowing I smelled bad and couldn't do anything about it. Noticed people wrinkling their noses or stepping back when I came near them. Strangers in stores would move away from me in aisles. Cashiers would lean back when I paid for items. Even my own family members started keeping physical distance from me. The shame was crushing, but I reminded myself this was temporary and necessary, that saving my leg was worth a few months of social discomfort. My wife Margaret started making comments about the smell within the first week, asking if I was showering enough or using deodorant, seeming frustrated when I explained I was doing everything possible. But the medication caused unavoidable odor. She'd wrinkle her nose when I entered rooms, started opening windows immediately whenever I sat down somewhere, began spraying air freshener around the house constantly. Her reactions made me feel like something disgusting instead of her husband dealing with a medical issue beyond his control. My son David and his wife Rachel, who lived with us in our large house, were even worse in their reactions, making no effort to hide their disgust about my condition. David would make comments like, "Dad, you really need to do something about that smell," even after I'd explained repeatedly that I was doing everything medically possible. Rachel started refusing to be in the same room with me, would literally turn around and leave if I entered a space she was occupying, treated me like I was contaminated or dangerous instead of just dealing with medication side effects. Watched my family's patience and compassion disappear over the weeks as the smell persisted, noticed them having conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, saw them exchanging looks of disgust when they thought I wasn't watching. Started spending most of my time alone in my bedroom because being around them made me feel worthless and ashamed, isolated myself to avoid seeing the contempt in their eyes every time they looked at me. Never imagined that a medical side effect I couldn't control would make my own family treat me like I was less than human. My wife Margaret and son David had spent the past several years climbing the social ladder in our community, making friends with wealthy people from the country club Margaret had joined and business circles David moved in through his corporate job. They'd become obsessed with impressing these rich friends, constantly talking about who owned what property or drove which luxury car, measuring their own worth by the wealth of the people they associated with. I'd watched this transformation happen gradually, seen them become people who valued money and status over genuine relationships and family bonds. Started noticing about 2 months into my medication treatment that they were excluding me from social gatherings and events they'd previously included me in, making excuses about why I couldn't attend dinners at restaurants or parties at friends' homes. Margaret would say things like, "This dinner is just for the younger crowd," or, "You wouldn't enjoy this event anyway with your leg still healing," when really she just didn't want me there smelling bad in front of her wealthy friends. David would claim business dinners were colleagues only, even though he used to bring me along to networking events before my medical issues started. The exclusion became more blatant and cruel as time went on. They'd literally hide me in my bedroom when guests came to our house, instead of just explaining I had a medical condition causing temporary side effects. Margaret would come to my room an hour before guests arrived and tell me I needed to stay upstairs with the door closed until everyone left. Said my presence would make people uncomfortable and ruin the social atmosphere she was trying to create. Treated me like a shameful secret that needed to be concealed rather than her husband of 32 years dealing with a health problem. David was even more brutal in his honesty about why they were hiding me. Told me directly one day that I smelled terrible and was embarrassing them in front of people who mattered to their social standing and business opportunities. Said their wealthy friends had standards and expectations about the kind of people they associated with, that showing up places with a father who reeked of body odor reflected poorly on the whole family. Made it clear he valued the opinions of rich strangers more than his own father's dignity and feelings. Rachel, my daughter-in-law, was the worst of all three of them in how she treated me during those months, made theatrical displays of disgust whenever I entered a room she was in. Would literally spray air freshener in my direction while I was standing there, waving her hand in front of her face and making gagging sounds like I was the most revolting thing she'd ever encountered. Complained constantly to David and Margaret about how unfair it was that she had to live in a house with someone who smelled so bad. Acted like my medical condition was a personal insult directed at her specifically. They'd have conversations right in front of me about how my smell was affecting their ability to entertain and maintain their social status, discussing me like I was an object or a problem to be solved rather than a family member suffering through necessary medical treatment. Margaret would say things like, "We can't keep canceling on people, they'll think something's wrong with us." And David would respond, "We need to figure out a better system for keeping him away from guests." Never once did any of them express concern about how the medication was affecting me or sympathy for what I was going through. Started hearing them refer to their rich friends as people who matter, in contrast to me, who apparently didn't matter anymore now that I had a medical condition that made me socially inconvenient. They'd gotten so absorbed in their shallow social climbing that they'd forgotten basic human decency and family loyalty. Had decided that impressing wealthy acquaintances was more important than treating an elderly family member with respect during a health crisis. The medications were breaking down the infection in my leg, but my family's cruelty was breaking down my spirit and sense of self-worth. Realized they were ashamed of me not because I'd done anything wrong, but because my medical condition didn't fit the perfect image they wanted to project to their wealthy social circle. Because they'd rather pretend I didn't exist than explain to their fancy friends that I was dealing with unavoidable medication side effects while healing from a serious injury. Last Friday morning, Margaret announced at breakfast that they were hosting an extremely important dinner party that evening. Said David had invited potential business partners worth millions who could make or break a deal he'd been working on for months. She explained that these were sophisticated, wealthy people with high standards who were used to luxury and perfection, that everything about the evening needed to be flawless to impress them properly. Then she turned to me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, cold and calculating instead of loving or concerned. She told me directly that I would not be part of the dinner party in any capacity, said I needed to stay completely out of sight while the guests were present because my odor would ruin the impression they were trying to make. Thought she meant I should stay upstairs in my bedroom like I'd done for previous gatherings. Said I understood and would keep to myself during the evening. But Margaret shook her head and said the bedroom wasn't enough this time, that these particular guests were too important to risk any chance of me being seen or smelled. Margaret explained that I would be staying in the downstairs bathroom during the entire party, the small toilet room near the kitchen that was barely 6 feet square with no windows. Said it was the only space far enough from the dining and living areas where guests would be gathered, that I'd need to stay there quietly from 6 in the evening until everyone left, which she estimated would be around midnight. Stared at her in disbelief, thinking she had to be joking about locking me in a bathroom for 6 hours, but her face showed she was completely serious. David walked into the kitchen during this conversation and immediately agreed with his mother's plan, said they couldn't take any chances with business partners this wealthy and influential. Told me I needed to cooperate and understand how important this evening was for his career and their social standing. Acted like asking me to spend hours locked in a tiny bathroom was a reasonable request rather than cruel and degrading treatment. Rachel joined in, saying she'd already planned the perfect menu and decorations and couldn't have anything ruining the impression they'd worked so hard to create. Tried to argue that locking me in a bathroom was excessive and humiliating, that I could simply stay in my bedroom with the door closed like I'd done before without causing any problems. Margaret got angry and said my bedroom was on the 2nd floor and guests might use the upstairs bathroom, that there was too much risk of me being encountered if I wasn't completely secured away from any area guests might access. David added that the smell from my medication could travel through the house, and they needed me contained in a space with a door they could seal. At 5:30 that evening, as I heard caterers arriving to set up for the party, David physically took my arm and guided me to the small downstairs bathroom near the kitchen. Told me to get inside and that they'd let me out after the last guest left. Estimated it would be 6 or 7 hours maximum. Stood in that tiny bathroom looking at the toilet and sink and bare walls, feeling humiliated and afraid, but still believing they'd actually let me out in a few hours like they promised. David closed the bathroom door, and I heard the distinct sound of the lock clicking from the outside, realized with horror that they'd actually locked me in rather than just asking me to stay there voluntarily. Started pounding on the door, immediately yelling for them to let me out, telling them this was going too far and they couldn't lock me in a bathroom like a prisoner. Heard David's voice through the door saying I needed to be quiet or I'd ruin everything, that if I kept making noise he'd leave me in there even longer. Kept pounding and yelling, but heard music being turned up loud in the house. Realized they were drowning out my voice so I couldn't be heard by arriving guests. Heard laughter and conversation starting in the rooms above me as the party began. Heard glasses clinking and people enjoying themselves while I sat trapped in a locked bathroom. Never imagined my own family would actually imprison me like this. Couldn't believe they valued impressing rich strangers more than treating me with basic human dignity. The first few hours in that locked bathroom I kept believing they'd let me out soon, kept thinking the party would end around midnight like Margaret had said, and someone would come unlock the door. Sat on the closed toilet lid trying to stay calm, checking my watch every 15 minutes waiting for the sounds of the party to die down. Could hear music and laughter filtering down from upstairs, heard the clink of glasses and voices of people enjoying expensive food and wine while I was trapped in a 6-foot square room with no windows and barely enough space to stand. Midnight came and went with no sign of anyone coming to let me out. The party sounds continued above me, showing no indication of guests leaving. Started pounding on the door again around 1 in the morning, yelling for Margaret or David to please let me out now that the evening should be ending. Nobody came. The music just got turned up louder, drowning out my voice, left me screaming until my throat was raw and my fists hurt from hitting the door. Realized with growing terror that they weren't planning to let me out when the party ended, that I might be trapped in here much longer than the 6 or 7 hours they'd promised. By 3 in the morning, my injured leg was throbbing with pain from standing and sitting on the hard toilet for so many hours without being able to stretch or move properly. The small bathroom had no space to lie down or extend my leg, could barely take 2 steps in any direction before hitting a wall. Started drinking water from the sink because my mouth was dry from yelling and crying. Realized this might be the only thing keeping me alive if they really were planning to leave me locked in here for an extended time. The party finally seemed to end around 4 in the morning based on the sounds of doors closing and cars leaving. Waited another hour expecting someone to come unlock the bathroom door any minute. 5 o'clock came with silence from upstairs, then 6, then 7, and nobody came. Started pounding on the door again, screaming for them to let me out, begging Margaret to please unlock the door because I'd cooperated and stayed quiet during their party. Heard nothing in response except the sound of my own voice echoing in the tiny tiled space. Saturday morning turned into afternoon, and I was still locked in that bathroom with no food and only sink water to drink, my legs screaming in agony from the infection and from being unable to properly rest or elevate it. Could hear footsteps occasionally walking past the bathroom door. Heard Margaret and David and Rachel talking and laughing like it was a normal day. Heard them discussing how well the party had gone and how impressed their guests had been. Nobody mentioned letting me out or even checking if I was still alive in there. Screamed until my voice gave out completely and I could barely make sounds anymore. Pounded on the door until my hands were bruised and swollen. Cried until I had no tears left and just sat there in numb despair. Started having trouble standing because my injured leg couldn't support my weight anymore after so many hours. Had to sit on the floor leaning against the wall because the toilet was too uncomfortable. The tile was freezing cold and made my whole body ache. Made the pain in my leg even worse as I tried to find any position that didn't cause agony. Saturday night came, and I'd been locked in that bathroom for over 24 hours with no food, my stomach cramping from hunger and my head pounding from dehydration despite drinking sink water. Could hear them having dinner upstairs. Heard the sounds of a normal family evening while I suffered in a locked room barely bigger than a closet. Realized they weren't going to let me out. That they'd decided keeping me imprisoned was easier than dealing with my smell around their house and their wealthy friends. By Sunday morning, I'd lost track of time and started having trouble thinking clearly from the dehydration and hunger and pain. Couldn't remember how many hours or days I'd been trapped. My injured leg had swollen badly and felt hot to the touch, suggesting the infection might be getting worse without my medications. By the second day locked in that bathroom, I'd given up all hope that my family would let me out, started believing I would actually die in that tiny room, and they'd claim I'd wandered off or had some kind of accident. Couldn't understand how the people who were supposed to love me most in the world could treat me with such inhuman cruelty. Couldn't process that my wife of 32 years and my own son had decided imprisoning me was an acceptable solution to the inconvenience of my medical condition. Sat on the cold tile floor with my back against the wall, crying silently because I had no voice left to scream. My only crime was having a smell I couldn't control from medication that was keeping my leg from being amputated, dealing with side effects from drugs that were necessary to save my life and mobility. I'd done nothing wrong, hadn't hurt anyone or caused any real harm. Just had the misfortune of needing strong antibiotics that made me socially inconvenient for my family's wealthy friends. They'd decided that impressing rich strangers was more important than treating me like a human being deserving of basic dignity and freedom. Started thinking about all the years I'd worked to provide for Margaret and David, all the sacrifices I'd made to give them comfortable lives and opportunities I'd never had myself. Worked long hours for decades to pay for our house and David's private school education and college tuition. Supported Margaret's expensive hobbies and social activities without complaint. Loved them unconditionally and thought they felt the same way about me. Never imagined they'd repay 30 years of devotion by locking me in a bathroom to suffer alone. The physical pain had become almost unbearable by Sunday afternoon, my infected leg swollen and hot, suggesting the infection was getting worse without my medications, my whole body aching from sitting on hard tile for over 40 hours. Felt dizzy and confused from lack of food and inadequate water intake, my vision blurring at the edges and my thoughts becoming disconnected and strange. Knew these were signs of severe dehydration and possibly infection spreading through my bloodstream. Knew I was in real medical danger, but had no way to get help. Started having dark thoughts about whether dying might be easier than continuing to live with the knowledge that my family hated me enough to do this. Wondered if maybe they were actively hoping I'd die in this bathroom so they wouldn't have to deal with me anymore. Maybe locking me away wasn't just about hiding me during a party, but about getting rid of me permanently. Letting me die of neglect, and then claiming ignorance about what happened. The thoughts spiraled darker as the hours passed with no rescue coming. Heard them walking past the bathroom door multiple times each day, going about their normal routines. Heard Rachel complaining about needing to use this bathroom but being told to use the upstairs one instead. She'd said something like, "When are we letting him out?" And I'd heard David respond, "Not yet. We have more people coming over later this week." Realized with horror that they were planning to keep me locked in here indefinitely, that the party on Friday had just been the beginning of using this bathroom as my prison whenever they had guests. Lost control of my bladder at some point Sunday evening because I couldn't hold it anymore after 2 days, sat in my own urine on that bathroom floor feeling the last shreds of my dignity dissolve. This was what my life had become because I needed medication to fight an infection, reduced to sitting in my own waste in a locked bathroom while my family enjoyed their comfortable life upstairs. The humiliation was worse than the physical pain, worse than the hunger and thirst and fear. Stopped pounding on the door or calling out because I had no strength left and no hope that anyone would respond. Just sat in the dark once night fell because the bathroom light had no switch inside and they'd turned it off from outside. Couldn't see anything in the complete blackness. Couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. Felt like I was already dead and just waiting for my body to realize it and stop functioning. Our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who lived in the house next door, had been working in her garden Saturday afternoon planting flowers along the fence line that separated our properties. She was a retired school teacher in her late 60s who kept meticulous gardens and spent hours outside tending to her plants, someone who noticed everything happening in the neighborhood because she was always observing from her yard. Had been friendly with her for years. We'd chat over the fence occasionally about gardening and weather and neighborhood news. Mrs. Chen told me later that while she was planting bulbs near our shared fence on Saturday, she'd heard faint sounds coming from our house that didn't match the cheerful atmosphere she could see through our windows. Heard what sounded like weak crying and occasional thumping noises, sounds of distress that seemed wrong given that she could see Margaret and David and Rachel moving around inside, looking relaxed and happy. The contrast between the sounds of suffering and the appearance of normalcy made her instincts tell her something was deeply wrong. She'd walked to our front door Saturday evening and knocked, planning to ask if everything was okay because the sounds had been bothering her all afternoon. Margaret answered the door with a bright smile and cheerful greeting, asked what she could do for Mrs. Chen. Mrs. Chen explained she'd heard some concerning sounds from our property and wanted to make sure everyone was all right. Asked if I was home because she hadn't seen me in several days and knew I'd been recovering from leg surgery. Margaret had told her smoothly that I was fine, but resting upstairs recovering from my injury, that the sounds she'd heard were probably from television or maybe animals in the yard. Thanked Mrs. Chen for her concern, but assured her everything was perfectly normal and there was nothing to worry about. Mrs. Chen said later that something about Margaret's demeanor felt off, too smooth and rehearsed. Her smile not reaching her eyes when she talked about me being upstairs resting. Mrs. Chen went home, but couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret had been lying to her, that the sounds she'd heard hadn't been television or animals, but genuine human distress. She'd lived next to us for over a decade and knew what normal household sounds were, knew the difference between regular noise and someone crying for help. The sounds had come from the lower level of our house near the kitchen area. Nowhere near where upstairs bedrooms would be if I was supposedly resting. Sunday morning, Mrs. Chen was back in her garden early and heard the sounds again, weaker this time but definitely human, definitely coming from inside our house at ground level. Heard faint thumping against what sounded like a door, heard weak moaning that made her skin crawl with concern. Watched our house and saw Margaret and David and Rachel moving around inside going about their Sunday morning routine. Saw them eating breakfast in the kitchen area, near where the distress sounds were coming from, but showing no concern or reaction. The disconnect between the obvious suffering happening somewhere in our house and my family's complete lack of concern or response convinced Mrs. Chen that something criminal was happening. She'd seen enough in her years as a teacher to recognize when people were deliberately ignoring someone in distress, when adults were choosing to let someone suffer rather than helping them. Her instincts screamed that I was in serious danger and my family wasn't going to help me. Mrs. Chen went inside her house and called the police non-emergency line, told them she was requesting a welfare check on her neighbors because she'd heard sounds of distress for over 24 hours that the family was ignoring. Explained she'd spoken to my wife who'd lied about where I was, that she was genuinely concerned something terrible was happening. The dispatcher told her they'd send officers to check on the situation, that welfare checks were taken seriously, especially when elderly residents were involved. Mrs. Chen watched from her window as the police car pulled up to our house Sunday evening around 7 o'clock, saw 2 officers get out and approach our front door. Said a prayer that whatever was happening to me would be discovered in time, that her decision to call police wouldn't be dismissed as an overreacting neighbor, but would actually save someone who needed help desperately. The doorbell rang Sunday evening around 7 o'clock, and I heard footsteps rushing around upstairs. Heard Margaret's voice sounding stressed, asking David what police were doing at the door. From my position collapsed on the bathroom floor, I tried to make noise to alert whoever was outside, but my voice was completely gone, and I barely had strength to move. Heard the front door opening, and Margaret's voice switching to cheerful and confused, asking the officers what this was about and if something was wrong in the neighborhood. Officer Martinez introduced himself and his partner, Officer Stevens, explained they'd received a welfare check request from a neighbor who'd heard concerning sounds and wanted to make sure all household members were safe and accounted for. Margaret laughed in that fake way she did when nervous and told them everything was fine, that their neighbor Mrs. Chen was elderly and probably confused about what she'd heard. The officers asked politely if they could come inside to verify everyone's welfare since that was procedure for these calls. Could hear Margaret reluctantly letting them into the house, heard their footsteps in the entryway as she made small talk trying to seem cooperative and normal. Officer Martinez asked how many people lived in the household, and Margaret told them it was herself, her son David, and her daughter-in-law Rachel. There was a pause, and then I heard Officer Martinez ask where I was, said he'd noticed my car in the driveway, and public records showed 4 adults registered at this address, including Margaret's husband. Margaret's voice faltered slightly as she told them I was upstairs sleeping because I'd been recovering from leg surgery, and the medication made me very tired. Officer Martinez asked if they could verify I was okay since the welfare check specifically mentioned concerns about an elderly male resident. Heard Margaret making excuses about not wanting to disturb me, saying I needed my rest, but the officer insisted they needed to see me in person to complete their welfare check properly. Heard footsteps going upstairs and then coming back down. Heard Margaret's voice getting more stressed as she apparently couldn't produce me from the bedroom where she'd claimed I was sleeping. Officer Martinez's tone became more serious, asking again where I was, saying they couldn't leave until they'd accounted for all household residents. David's voice joined in trying to support his mother's story, but sounding increasingly nervous and defensive. Then I heard it. Officer Stevens saying he'd heard a faint noise coming from somewhere on the ground floor, asking what was behind the closed door near the kitchen. Margaret said quickly that it was just a bathroom, nobody was in there, but Officer Stevens said he definitely heard something. I summoned every bit of strength I had left and hit the bathroom door weakly with my hand, managed to make a faint thumping sound that the officer must have heard because his voice became sharp and commanding. Officer Martinez demanded they open the bathroom door immediately, his tone making clear this was no longer a friendly welfare check but a serious investigation. Heard Margaret stammering that she didn't have the key, heard David saying something incoherent, heard Rachel starting to cry. The officer said if they didn't open the door in 10 seconds he'd force it open himself, started counting down while I hit the door again with my last bit of energy. Heard a crash as Officer Stevens kicked the bathroom door, the lock breaking and light suddenly flooding into the darkness where I'd been trapped for over 48 hours. Couldn't open my eyes properly from the sudden brightness after sitting in darkness, felt hands on my shoulders and heard Officer Martinez's voice saying, "Oh my God," as he saw my condition. Heard him immediately calling for paramedics on his radio, heard him describing a male in his 70s found locked in a bathroom, severely dehydrated, sitting in his own waste, possible infection and medical emergency. Tried to speak, but no sound would come from my destroyed throat. Tried to point at Margaret and David to tell the officers they'd done this deliberately, but could only make weak gestures. Officer Stevens was asking them loudly why their father and husband was locked in a bathroom, why they'd lied about his location, demanding answers while Margaret and David stood silent, realizing they'd been caught doing something they couldn't explain away. The second that bathroom door crashed open and light flooded into the darkness I'd been trapped in for 48 hours. Something inside me shattered completely, and I started screaming, even though my voice was barely a whisper. Every moment of humiliation over the past months came pouring out, every time they'd hidden me from their friends, every disgusted look they'd given me, every cruel comment about my smell, culminating in 2 days locked in a bathroom sitting in my own waste. The scream that came from my destroyed throat was more animal than human, pure anguish and betrayal that couldn't be contained anymore. Officer Martinez knelt beside me on the bathroom floor, trying to calm me down, while Officer Stevens called for backup and paramedics, both of them looking horrified at my condition and the situation they'd discovered. I was covered in my own urine and sweat, my injured leg swollen to almost twice its normal size and burning with infection, my lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration, my hands bruised from pounding on the door. Must have looked like someone who'd been tortured, rather than someone whose family had locked them away to hide them from dinner guests. Tried to tell the officers what had happened through my broken voice and tears, pointed at Margaret and David and Rachel standing in the hallway, watching with pale faces. Managed to gasp out words like, "locked me in," and 2 days, and no food, while Officer Martinez listened with an expression of growing rage. He asked if my family had deliberately imprisoned me in this bathroom, and I nodded desperately, trying to make him understand this wasn't an accident or misunderstanding, but intentional cruelty. Paramedics arrived within minutes and immediately started treating me for severe dehydration, and what they suspected was a serious infection in my leg, hooking me up to IV fluids and checking my vital signs. One of them asked how long I'd been locked in the bathroom, and when I managed to whisper 2 days, her face went hard with anger. She looked at Margaret and David and said, "You locked your husband in a bathroom for 2 days?" with such contempt in her voice that Margaret started crying and insisting this was all a misunderstanding. Officer Martinez stood up from where he'd been crouching next to me and walked over to where my family stood in the hallway, his hand moving toward the handcuffs on his belt. Started asking them direct questions about why I was locked in a bathroom, how long I'd been there, who had locked the door, and why nobody had let me out. David tried to explain about the dinner party and my smell problem, but his words just made everything sound worse, made it clear they'd deliberately imprisoned me to hide me from their wealthy friends. More police officers arrived as backup, and I watched through my tears and exhaustion as they placed handcuffs on Margaret, David, and Rachel one by one while reading them their rights. Margaret was crying and saying this was all a mistake, that she'd only meant to keep me there during the party and then forgot about me. David was silent and pale, realizing how serious this was becoming. Rachel was sobbing that she'd told them to let me out, but nobody had listened to her, trying to distance herself from the decisions her husband and mother-in-law had made. The paramedics were preparing to transport me to the hospital when Officer Martinez came back over and asked if I wanted to press charges against my family for what they'd done. Nodded emphatically, despite the pain and exhaustion, wanted them to face consequences for imprisoning me like an animal because my medical condition embarrassed them in front of their rich friends. The officer told me they'd be charging all 3 with elder abuse, false imprisonment, and neglect, that what they'd done was serious felony criminal behavior. Heard Margaret screaming as they led her to the police car in handcuffs, heard her calling my name and begging me to tell the police this was a misunderstanding. Couldn't respond and didn't want to. Just let the paramedics load me onto a stretcher and carry me out of that house where my own family had tried to hide me away like garbage. Watched through the ambulance windows as neighbors came out to see what was happening. Saw Mrs. Chen standing in her yard with her hand over her mouth looking devastated that her suspicions had been correct. Spent 5 days in the hospital recovering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, and a serious leg infection that had worsened dramatically during my 2 days locked in the bathroom without medication. Doctors said another 12 hours without treatment, and the infection could have spread to my bloodstream, causing sepsis that might have killed me. Told me I was extremely lucky Mrs. Chen had called police when she did. Had to stay on intravenous antibiotics and fluids while they stabilized my condition and got the infection under control again. Detective Morrison from the police department came to interview me on my second day in the hospital, recording my full statement about what had happened and asking detailed questions about my family's treatment of me over the past months. Told her everything about the medication side effects causing my odor, about being excluded from social events and hidden from their wealthy friends, about being physically locked in the bathroom for their dinner party and left there for 48 hours without food or water. She listened with visible anger on her face, taking notes and occasionally shaking her head in disgust. The detective explained that Margaret, David, and Rachel had all been formally charged with multiple felonies, including elder abuse, causing great bodily harm, false imprisonment, and willful neglect of a dependent adult. Said the charges were serious with potential prison sentences ranging from 3 to 8 years, depending on the individual's role in what happened. Told me the district attorney was treating this as a priority case because the evidence was overwhelming and the cruelty was especially egregious. Evidence against my family was collected quickly and thoroughly. Police had photographed the locked bathroom showing the small space where I'd been confined and the condition I'd been found in. Had statements from the 2 officers who'd discovered me and the paramedics who'd treated me. Medical records documenting my injuries and dehydration. Mrs. Chen gave a detailed statement about the sounds she'd heard, and Margaret's lies when she'd asked about me, about watching the house and seeing my family going about their normal activities while I suffered. Most damning were statements from several of their wealthy friends who'd attended the dinner party that Friday night, people the police tracked down and interviewed about the evening. Multiple guests reported that Margaret and David had made jokes during the party about keeping the old man locked away and hiding the embarrassment, comments they'd thought were exaggerations or dark humor until police explained I'd literally been locked in a bathroom. Some guests admitted they'd heard faint noises during the party that Margaret had dismissed as plumbing or house sounds. One of David's business partners told police that David had made comments over the past months about his father being a social liability because of medical issues, had complained about having to hide me during important gatherings. Another friend reported that Rachel had posted on social media about the challenges of living with someone who had hygiene problems. Posts that took on sinister meaning once police explained the context. Everything they'd said and done was being used to prove premeditation and deliberate cruelty rather than a tragic accident. The trial happened 6 months after my hospital stay. Once I'd recovered enough to testify in person, prosecutors presenting the case as 3 adults who'd systematically abused an elderly family member and then imprisoned him in inhumane conditions. Margaret, David, and Rachel all tried to minimize their actions, claiming they'd only meant to keep me in the bathroom for a few hours, and then genuinely forgot about me. The jury didn't believe them, given the evidence of repeated abuse and the fact they'd walked past that locked bathroom door dozens of times over 2 days. All 3 were convicted on every charge after the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, judge calling their behavior some of the most callous elder abuse she'd seen in 20 years on the bench. Margaret received a 4-year prison sentence. David got 5 years because he'd been the one who'd physically locked me in the bathroom, and Rachel got 3 years for her participation and failure to help me. They were all ordered to have no contact with me for the duration of their sentences, and potentially forever depending on protective orders I could file. Sat in that courtroom watching them be sentenced and felt no satisfaction or victory. Just exhaustion and sadness that my own family had valued impressing rich strangers more than treating me like a human being deserving of basic dignity. Margaret is currently serving her 4-year sentence at a women's correctional facility 2 hours from where I used to live. David is in a men's prison serving his 5 years, and Rachel is at a minimum security facility serving her 3-year sentence. All 3 became convicted felons with elder abuse and false imprisonment on their permanent records. Crimes that will follow them for the rest of their lives and make employment difficult when they're released. Their wealthy friends abandoned them immediately once the criminal charges became public. Nobody wanted to associate with people who'd locked an elderly man in a bathroom for 2 days. My leg eventually healed completely after additional surgery to clean out the infection that had worsened during my imprisonment. Took another 8 months of treatment and physical therapy, but I can walk normally again without pain. The medication that caused the odor problem was changed to a different antibiotic that didn't have the same side effects. The smell that had been used to justify my family's cruelty disappeared within weeks of switching treatments. The whole situation had been temporary and manageable, but my family had chosen imprisonment and abuse rather than basic compassion and patience. I live now in a senior living community about 30 miles from my old house, Sold the property because I couldn't stand being in the place where I'd been locked in that bathroom and left to suffer. The senior community is specifically designed for people with medical conditions and mobility issues, where nobody judges or excludes residents for health problems they can't control. Have made friends here who understand what it's like to deal with medication side effects and aging bodies that don't work perfectly. People who treat each other with dignity and kindness. The staff at my senior community knows my full story, because it was in the news extensively when my family was arrested and convicted, but they've been nothing but supportive and protective of my well-being. Have a comfortable apartment with my own bathroom that I can lock from the inside, never from the outside, something I specifically requested because I still have nightmares about being trapped. See a therapist twice a month to work through the trauma of what happened, the feelings of betrayal and worthlessness that came from being treated like garbage by people who were supposed to love me. The emotional scars from those 2 days locked in the bathroom are deeper and longer lasting than the physical injuries ever were. Wake up sometimes in the middle of the night panicking that I'm trapped in a small space with no way out. Can't use small public restrooms without feeling anxious, avoid enclosed spaces whenever possible, struggle with trusting anyone after my own family proved that love and loyalty meant nothing compared to social status and wealth. The therapist says it will take years to fully process the trauma, that being imprisoned by family members is a unique kind of betrayal that affects people profoundly. Margaret sent me a letter from prison 6 months into her sentence, begging for forgiveness and claiming she never meant for things to go so far, saying the dinner party pressure had made her act irrationally. I returned the letter unopened because there's nothing she could say that would make me forget being locked in a bathroom for 48 hours, sitting in my own waste while she entertained wealthy friends upstairs. David and Rachel have not attempted to contact me, probably advised by their lawyers that any communication could violate protective orders and add time to their sentences. I'm 74 years old now, living peacefully in a community where my dignity is respected and my medical needs are understood. Finally free from the people who decided I was too embarrassing to exist around their rich friends. Survived 2 days locked in a 6-foot bathroom because my family valued social status more than my humanity. Survived the infection and dehydration and emotional devastation that came from their cruelty. They're all in prison now, serving time in cells probably smaller than that bathroom they locked me in, and I wake up every morning in my apartment grateful that I'm free and safe and surrounded by people who actually care whether I live or die.